For more than 3 decades, the Worcester Regional Research Bureau has worked to ensure informed and fact-based public policy. We look at issues affecting the city and the region and offer insight and best practices from across the world. As part of this mission, we host a series of informational forums such as this today on topics of significant interest in Worcester. As technology is integrated into lives, the opportunities are vast to use data and technology to improve city services. The Research Bureau wanted to convene experts in the field of smart cities, and we're pleased today that we have President Lori Leshin, our own Worcester expert, as our moderator who will lead the discussion today. We could not do our work without the support of businesses, philanthropies, and people like you. I especially want to highlight today's sponsors, Commerce Bank, a division of Berkshire Bank, Polar Beverages, Massport, and Country Bank. Thank you again for coming out. I'm pleased to introduce President Leshin, President of Worcester Polytechnic Institute, whom she will introduce our panel.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to WPI. It's great to see you here. I will admit it's our spring break, so if it feels a little quiet, that's why. The students go whoo, and some of the faculty go whoo, and some of the faculty use this as a great time to get lots of work done. At least some of our faculty are here today, so that's great to see too. Of course, we're thrilled to have you here with us. If you're going to have a conversation in Worcester about something smart, this is a good place to do it, I think. So, this is actually a topic that is on our minds right now. This whole concept of the smart world. The smart world is here, right? And thinking about Worcester as a smart city in response to this global movement the timing couldn't be better. So I really want to thank the Research Bureau for engaging us in this conversation and for pulling this event together with our great panelists, who I will introduce to you in a second. But I just thought I would take 2 minutes and try and set some context from our perspective, because we've been thinking about this a lot on our campus lately. And this idea of a smart world or smart cities within it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's actually part of a global evolution that goes back to the beginning of what we all call the Industrial Revolution, right? And smart cities and smart world concepts are an emergence of that construct. And I have like one quick little plot here that talks a bit about how we got here, right? So if you think about the history of our great city, Worcester, like so many cities, it boomed in large part actually because of the Industrial Revolution that was really enabled by some key technology advancements, right? The steam engine allowed production to be mechanized, and that production and the products that came from it really are the thing that underlied that first Industrial Revolution. And in fact, the founding of WPI emerged directly from that first Industrial Revolution. Local industrialists needed workforce and educated people in their community and came together to start a university. And in fact, one of the first 2 buildings they built was as a direct result of trying to incorporate the technology and practices from the first Industrial Revolution into the founding curriculum of WPI. So our history is very tied to this too. Fast forward, that was sort of the mid-1800s, right? Fast forward about 50 years, and the electricity and the electrification revolution is known as the second Industrial Revolution, right? So electrification allowed production to become mass production, and factories could stay open longer, and people came together. And of course, it fundamentally changed cities too. Electrification was a huge transition for our cities. At the time at WPI, in the early 1900s, we founded our electrical engineering program and built a building for our electrical engineering department where the trolleys of Worcester used to come in to be serviced by our students. And again, this Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed our curriculum, changed our campus, changed our city. 50 years ago, the third Industrial Revolution was really around the rise of computation. And there's nothing in our lives that hasn't been touched by that revolution, right? Of course, it's fundamentally changed almost everything we do in all of our businesses on our campus. It changed us. We're just next weekend going to celebrate the 50 years since the founding of our computer science department. we built a building, Fuller Labs, that housed that computer science department. So our campus changed, our curriculum changed, our structure changed. Of course, our city changed, and maybe having formerly worked in government myself, sometimes infusing of these new technologies can be challenging and doesn't happen right away. But over time, it has dramatically changed the way our city operates, automation and computation. So the fourth industrial revolution we're standing on the cusp of that next wave, that next dramatic change, and it's happening fast. It's happening so much faster even than the other industrial revolutions that led to it. It is all about the integration of computation and stuff, right? This so-called Internet of Things, the incredible opportunity to collect data about absolutely everything and try and understand it and use that to really drive our decision making. So we're also responding to that, and today, actually, just about a week and a half ago, our board approved, so I can announce here for the first time that WPI is also responding to this fourth industrial revolution. The next new building on this campus will be a smart world building that's going to be focused. Yes, thank you for clapping. We will be building about 100,000 square foot building on the main campus to bring together our researchers in data science, computational sciences, architectural engineering, all of these pieces that come together interdisciplinary across boundaries to support the idea of how do we leverage data to do everything we do better. And that's really fundamentally the concept that underlies so much of this. And it's in response to where the world is going. I was watching a video on YouTube that one of my trustees sent me the other day that talked about artificial intelligence and how it's driving so much. But it had an amazing statistic, which is of all the artificial intelligence companies that have ever been started in the history of the world, 50% of them have been started in the last 2 years. So it is moving fast, and this is a train that's coming, and we've got to get on it. And Worcester has a real opportunity to lead here with our integration of great institutions, universities, with local government, with our citizens, and it's all about making their lives better. So I hope this helps to set some context of why we've landed where we are, what the opportunity space is, and we're going to hear so much more about that from our panelists, which I am thrilled to introduce them right now. Maybe I will start by having just introducing our first panelist and letting him say a few words, and then inviting our others up. So first we're going to hear from John Spring, who has spent nearly a decade in the energy industry with a focus on energy efficiency, global procurement, solar energy storage, partnerships, innovation, and new business development. He is now helping lead national grids, smart cities, and smart grid throughout Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. And he's going to kick us off with some remarks about smart cities. So John, where did John go? There you are. Come on up and maybe give your remarks, and then we'll bring the full panel up.
Thank you for the warm introduction.
Yes, thanks,
Appreciate
John.
it.
Great to have you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm John Spring with National Grid. The reason I have Schenectady up here, I don't know if anyone's heard of Schenectady, New York, but we're doing a project out there, and I wanted to focus on what we're trying to do with smart cities. Just to give you a real quick background on National Grid, one thing that struck me interesting, what you were saying, was mainly around innovation and how a lot of things are changing. All right, if you think about grid, National Grid, you think about your electric company, your gas company, you may not think innovation. You may not think, oh, this is the most innovative company, but the reality is we're on the cusp of a lot of change ourselves. We're trying to take that next step into what we think will be a smarter world, right? So smart grid being one of those things. I know Worcester here has piloted a lot of smart grid technology. A lot of our territory in New York and Rhode Island and Massachusetts is about to embark on smarter grids. Smarter meters will be in your homes. This is happening, right? And I don't know how many people here have like a Nest thermostat or any connected home devices, but all this stuff is starting to try to figure out a way to work together. And in a small city of Schenectady, New York, we have what we're calling a REV demonstration project. And in New York, what they call REV is reforming the energy vision. And we're doing something similar here with grid modernization efforts in Massachusetts and Rhode Island as well. And what we're trying to do is look at our existing infrastructure. In New York State particularly, I think we own 273,000 streetlights. And one of the concepts that we came up with a few years back was, how do we take what we have today and make it smarter? So taking those old, just halide lights that you see out there, the yellow ones, and changing them over to LED, that's one new technology, right? but taking it a little bit step further and looking into how we might be able to make these smart streetlights and building out a communications network similar to smart grid. How do we leverage that for the benefit of a city? So meeting with the mayor and meeting with the city, they have all these aspirations to become more intelligent, to be cleaner, to run more efficiently. How do you do that? And then how do we launch the Internet of Things, if you will, and kind of take this to the next level? And I think what we're trying to do out there, and I'll walk you through this real quick, is look at just that, right? There's a lot of technology out there that can help us create what we think is a smarter network. This is just one concept. It's really easy, just 1, 2, 3. But the reality is, it's all about a communications network and data. What do we do with that network if we're going to build that out from a utility perspective? And then all that data flowing across that network, what do we do with it? What does the city do with it? And how much does it cost? And what's the value behind it? And all these questions that everyone has. And we've met with dozens of cities who all want to become smarter and better, and no one knows how to do it, frankly. And that's what we keep trying to figure out ourselves is how do we do this? What do we learn from it? How do we do it together? So in Schenectady, we're trying to walk through all this stuff together. And I'll walk you through a few use cases that we have that we're exploring, but there's a million different things you could do with data and smart grid technology. Just real quick, it's kind of scary to think about, these are streetlights, and you don't think the streetlight's listening to you, but they can. There's microphones, there's sensors, there's all sorts of things. We can develop Wi-Fi networks. It's a little scary to think about the fact that there's almost a big brother kind of situation cooking up here that some people may be uncomfortable with. However, we're hoping to test that out through some of the residents in the city of Schenectady. We're going to be interviewing them, letting them kind of weigh in, if you will, on how they feel. Does this make their city feel safer? Does it make them feel Big Brother's watching? We're hoping to kind of learn as we go before we deploy this throughout our service territory in the coming years. And this is a list of a bunch of smart city programs, we're calling them. The reality is, other than the streetlights themselves, we're trying to focus a little bit on what we're calling optical sensors. And really that's cameras for the most part. It sounds more pleasing to call it optical sensor. But really, a lot of what most cities are looking for is ways to become more efficient on how they run their city. And if we can build out a network that we can put a bunch of these devices on, we're hoping to walk through value and use cases for the majority of these. And I don't want to spend a ton of time, right? We talked about smart streetlights. We're talking about optical sensors. And a lot of these sensors do more than just watch people, right? They count people, they count cars, they count bikes, they count buses. And what do you do with all this data? So now you know 12 buses went by this one street, or 100 people walked by one area. What does that mean? Could we sell that data to someone who's looking to develop land in this area? Or someone wants to open a restaurant on this street, and it seems to be a good place because people walk by or drive by. That's useful data that we could collect. And that's what we're hoping to do. It's not all just watching people, but it's part of it. Digital Patrol really is around law enforcement, meeting with the City of Schenectady's police department. They're really interested in what they could do with a lot of this data, how they might be able to solve crimes quicker. If they can do that, that could save a lot of money. I think an average, like a murder crime or a gunshot in a city can cost up to $1 million to investigate. And if you can reduce the time in which it would take to solve a crime or look into it, it can save a city a lot of money. Smart mobility, obviously, as an electric company, we're very intrigued with EVs. We're looking at how do we, as a utility, get involved in EV charging infrastructure. You know, if you build it, will they come? You know, the chicken and the egg. Everyone's trying to decide, you know, is there enough charging out there? Do people have range anxiety? You know, what can we do to help move the EV world into the next generation? I know myself, after I leave here, I have to drive out to Syracuse, New York, and I'm not taking my electric vehicle with me because I'm not sure I could make it in time on a full charge. So I have a little anxiety on that as well. Now, if I knew there was a nice flow of charging stations on my way out, then maybe that would change my driving habits. So we'll see how that goes in the years to come. Smart home, I brought this up earlier. What we were hoping to do when we build out our smart grid network, what we call is a home area network and a field area network. So there's a network out in the field, and there's networks that could be right around your home. And what we're hoping to do is kind of connect those two worlds, not just in the thermostat world, but there's other devices and things. It would be nice someday if you could ask your Siri or some other device that you speak into, what's my electric bill going to look like this month? Or, how much is this costing me to plug my car in? That would be really cool to someday be there, and we hope to get it there. Environmental monitoring is a really nice one that we've been looking into, mainly on how do we reduce CO2 emissions, look at pollution and things of that nature. Obviously, water metering, gas and electric metering, of course, because that's our job. Enhanced GIS solutions, really being able to look at cities. Parking seems to be an issue. Even here, I didn't know where to park this morning. It would be nice if I had a nice app that could tell me where to go, where to park, and a lot of this can be done through that smart grid technology. Traffic, I think, comes up quite a bit when you look at any city or any town, for that matter. How do you have a better flow of traffic through a network of sensors that can determine where traffic is, that can hook into street lights, etc. Traffic lights. That's something we're testing out in two downtown areas of Schenectady to look at how can we get better traffic flow through the city and maybe automate some of that a little bit as well. And we're working with some of the local schools there. I don't want to say they're as good as WPI, but
Obviously not.
clearly not. But they are helping us out. And this is not as probably as interesting or sexy, but waste management. One of the things we're looking at is having little sensors throughout the city inside city garbage cans. And that sounds kind of gross, but the reality is these sensors go back to a software network and show the city whether it's green, yellow, or red, or they're empty, getting full, or full. And then they can send Tim, who's one guy. Tim is the guy that goes and picks up the trash. So now Tim doesn't have to just drive around and look in the trash cans. Tim knows now if the trash can's full, he can go. And that saves a lot of time. And Tim doesn't have to drive around all day. So save some time, save some gas, save some money, and that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. So that's all I really had. It's just kind of a group of use cases, and I'm sure there's a ton more we can talk about, so I look forward to some questions and conversations.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Have a seat. Let me introduce our other panelists. So let me introduce our other two panelists so we can really get the conversation started. So first we have Nigel Jacob, who's the co-founder of Boston Mayor Marty Walsh's Office of New Urban Mechanics, which was a really innovative approach here. It is a civic innovation incubator and R&D lab within Boston City Hall. Nigel's work is about making urban life better via innovative, people-oriented applications of technology and design. Nigel, welcome. Come on up. And Dan O'Brien, welcome. He's an associate professor at Northeastern and co-director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, Bari, right? That's what we call it, yeah. And focuses on the ways that researchers, policymakers, and practitioners can work together to leverage modern digital data, big data, to better understand and serve cities. Welcome, Dan. It's great to have you. Come on up. So I'm going to come sit down here in a second, but I want to give each Nigel and John, or Nigel and Dan, I'm sorry, a chance to make a few comments as opening. So maybe Nigel, you can get us started and make a few comments, either response to what John had to say or your own perspective on smart cities you might want to share.
Sure. On. Thanks. I wanted to share a complementary perspective, thinking about how do you actually design these smart city solutions. So the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics is an organization I started under Mayor Menino back in the day in 2010, and the idea was to take a human-centric approach to designing innovative new services, and we've been doing that since that time. We've tried lots of different things over that nearly decade-long effort. Lots of collaborative projects. Dan is an old friend of mine. We work very closely with startups and universities and so on. And over that time, we've focused a lot on extracting empirical lessons about what is effective and what's not so effective. And so I just wanted to say very briefly, 3 lessons?
Yeah.
Okay, is that good?
Yeah.
So the
We
first.
can't remember any more than 3.
Okay,
so
right.
that's
3 is the
perfect.
magic number. That's what you learn in V school.
Yeah.
The first lesson I wanted to share was, so the idea here is, how do you build good smart cities solutions? And you can frankly swap in smart city for lots of euphemisms. You can sometimes call it civic tech. I was at a conference over the weekend where they called it urban tech. It's all the same stuff. Number 1, prioritize the needs of people, right? I think there is often in this world, in this of area of work, there's often times a question of as to what you prioritize for, right? So cities are sort of very large institutions, organizations, and they have lots of things going on. There's crime, there's housing rates, there's racial and social inequity, and there's sort of climate change, all these different things. And so given that sort of dense matrix of things that need to be addressed, which do you focus on? And our experience has been, when you start with the needs of people, you put them at the center of everything that you do, it leads you naturally into a mode in which you're trying to understand humans, right? You're trying to understand, why are people behaving the way that they do, and how can we respond? How can we lead people to more effective, like pro-social behaviors and so on? So that's number 1. Prioritize the needs of people. Number 2 is how you build is just as important as what you build, right? So this is all about process. This is where design kicks in, right? That when you are focused on the needs of people and you're not designing for them or at them, but designing with them and in collaboration with them, you get a completely different level of quality of solutions. You get more subtle solutions. You get solutions that are contextual, that understand the social history of our cities, right? And a city like Boston has a very complicated sort of racial history. And so the idea is, by designing, co-collaborating with people, you can actually get at those issues. And then lastly, it's maybe sort of a slightly counter narrative to the whole idea of a lot of smart city solutions. I hope you'll agree. I think you'll agree. Are very top down in their architecture, and which makes sense, right? But there's also just as much utility in focusing on a bottom up approach. So the last one I'll say is lesson that we've learned is to use technology to build trust. Americans don't like their government, right? And local government fares best, but that's a problem, right? So it means that we won't be able to take on the big challenges if we can't get beyond the simple issues of local issues of trust. And so we've often found, and a lot of the work that we've done with Dan has been understanding, can we actually use technology to build trust and build the behavior that comes from trust? So that's it.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think, let's see, on technology. Okay. Yeah, that's working.
If you
Yeah,
sing
I
to
think,
it, that's
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I think it's, to me, it just, that really strikes a chord around that, so it's so easy. And as a tech school, this is something we preach about all the time. It's so easy to let the tech drive everything. And really, it's got to be about the people driving everything. And so that, to make the super smart city, it's about how do you bring the brains of the people together in order to help have the technology really serve their needs. And that's such a critical thing. I love that perspective. That's great. Dan, why don't you jump in with some opening comments of your own, and welcome.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. So at the end of the panel here, I get to be sort of the academic provocateur, and I'll try to do so in as aspirational a way as possible. But I want to start with kind of running with Nigel's theme a little bit. I think that there's some discontents around the smart city, and I say this as a guy who does a lot of work with data and technology, and I think there's 3 of them. Because we envision this sort of futuristic Jetsonian future associated with that term, but then what is it right now, right? Where are we and how are we getting there? And I think there's 3 challenges. One is there's a lot of cities that cannot afford and cannot really do this sort of thing right now. And so Boston, and Nigel and I have been lucky to work in Boston, right, where there's a lot of resources, a lot of expertise, a lot of talent. I run a consortium of faculty and students from 12 different universities, right? So there's a ton of people in there that can kind of capitalize and partner in these kind of ventures. Now, I love John's presentation because for those who don't know where Schenectady is or what it looks like, it is one of those cities that you would say stereotypically can't access this sort of thing. And so I think John has sort of already spoken to the fact that the opportunity is starting to spread a bit, which I think is great to hear. The second one Nigel's already spoken to, so I'll summarize it very briefly, which is the fact that community groups, right, community members are not really a part of this conversation so much thus far. It's mainly collaborations between private sector and public sector, where public sector signs on a dotted line and private sector provides something, but community groups are not necessarily part of the conversation, or academics and public sector, or all three, kind of defining a research project, a potential deployment, but again, it's not always clear that the community is involved. And I think, I'm not going to speak too much about this because Nigel's really your expert here. They have done excellent kind of trailblazing work in thinking about how do we incorporate the community, and it's got to be more than just going into a community group in Roxbury or downtown Worcester and saying, here's a sensor, what do you want to do with it? Because chances are most people have no idea what to do with it, and you have to support them in some way. And Nigel and his team have been thinking about that a lot. The third one is kind of this issue, and John alluded to this a lot, where there's a ton of information, but it's not immediately clear what to do with it, right? And this to me is the fun part, right? I'm a data scientist. Looking at a brand new data set is a little bit like being a kid lying on your back looking up at clouds in the sky and trying to figure out what they look like, right? Because there's so much information there that we've never had before, right? So much detailed knowledge about the day-to-day operations of the city and pretty soon towns, right? Rural hamlets, right? If we really do deploy this sort of infrastructure far and wide, I think about the urban landscape, but it really could just be the landscape that we can see and understand and how people interact with it, how people use infrastructure, all of these things. But then the question is, where do you go? And I think WPI, from Worcester's perspective, and Clark and other local universities becomes a really natural partner for companies like National Grid, for the local government, for the state government, as they think about, okay, we've got a massive amount of information, what now, right? What questions do we answer? And as Nigel said, we've been working together for years. I just published a book called The Urban Commons, basically in partnership with Nigel and his team looking at 311 data, right? Years ago, we were sitting in a room together and we were trying to come up with a pilot project, and we said, all right, well, there's 300,000 calls for service sitting on a server over there. What can we find out from it? What are people calling about? How do we use this to better understand the way this new system works? What do we learn about Boston's neighborhoods through it? And so we were able over time to tell a very intricate story of how people take care of public spaces, why people use the system, how the system then works, how you then want to advertise the system, how do you make it more efficient as a collaboration between government and the public. And so I think that's just one example, and there's thousands, and so I think thinking creatively about what we can learn and what we can accomplish. And the last point I'll make, and Nigel touched on this a little bit, I think smart cities sort of assumes that the answer is efficiency, but speaking in terms like a computational scientist, you can always change your optimization parameter. You can always optimize for something else. And so I think we can also use it to think about equity. We can think about justice. We can think about democracy. We can think about resilience. These are all important societal values in addition to efficiency that we probably want to sort of plug into our equation, as it were, as we dig into the data. And we have the autonomy in that moment to determine what questions do we want to ask and what kind of answers are we looking for.
Wow, that's a great opening comments. Thank you all. I'm going to tee up a few questions here for the panel, but get ready because then we're coming out to you. So everybody be thinking about your questions because we want to get everybody engaged in the conversation. Wow, so many thought-provoking things from all three of you, different perspectives. I kind of want to come back to a very fundamental point here. We are kind of at the beginning of thinking about this, I think, as a city, although maybe some would argue that we already are taking steps, and I think that's probably true. But I kind of want to think about the beginning of this. If we were starting, today to say, okay, we really want to make a commitment around, Worcester as a smart city, which is a little brandy to me. It's like being smart about the data that we're collecting and using and the technology that we're embracing and how we're deploying it. What would you say to the city in terms of why we should make something like this a priority, in terms of what it can unlock, and what kind of early concrete steps would you recommend that we take? For example, are there trying to get some more specific recommendations from you or thoughts about the value here?
All right.
Go
Going to
for
me.
it. Go for it.
Whoever wants to jump in can jump in.
I mean, we're, as a utility, really new to smart city space, so it's hard for me to say what Worcester should do,
Yeah.
right? And all cities are different. What we're realizing is the more I talk to a Buffalo or Syracuse, or I was down in Providence last week, everyone has different needs, and every city's different. To your point, just learning what you've done in Boston over the years would be very interesting, and see where we could apply those learnings to other cities. But I mean, you really just have to look at the fundamentals. When I go and meet with a mayor or a city or town, it's particularly around safety, traffic, things of that nature, problems, if you will, problems in the town. How can technology solve problems? It's not always about making things prettier or making a city cleaner. However, those are attractive things, especially as Schenectady, New York's they're looking at economic development. How do they get people to stay there once they graduate college and maybe open a business there? And that's a big concern of the city. So how do we take technology and do that? So I don't know if I have an answer for you other than more questions.
But start a conversation.
It's a good way to start a conversation around problems
Yeah.
the city's facing, and maybe whether it's economic or safety or traffic or what have you. So.
Cool. I agree with everything that John said. I would, there's a couple different answers, one sort of broader and one more specific. So I would think the whole idea of like prioritizing for the needs of people would be a good place to start. Engaging the community in some kind of a process or a dialogue about what are the three things that we're most concerned about, what are we, and I'd like it, we shouldn't only, I was not trying to say what you said, but I think it's not only about what's broken,
Right.
it's also about aspirations, like
Yeah.
what do we want our future city to be and feel like and so on. So I think that's a very good place to start, but that takes a while, right?
Yeah.
And that's thorny and it's politically fraught. In a practical sense, I would say start a 311 system if you don't have one already. 311 systems are like the on-ramp for smart cities in a lot of ways. They're relatively sort of closed systems. Back in the day when we were first starting out, we had to build it from scratch, right? We had to work with the technology companies to build this. But now these things are pretty easy to go out and procure.
Buy one,
You can just buy one, and it has a number of different advantages. One, it provides that vital source of data that Dan was talking about, that we've all been talking about, and it also provides a point of collaboration between your residents and local government, right? So it gives people a role, right? So that they're out there, they're reporting potholes and graffiti, and so.
I should ask. Do we have? I don't even know.
I think you do.
Not quite the same, but we're getting there. Yeah. There's a lot of data that's
Yeah.
coming.
Oh, I'm sure you get calls. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Calls, tweets, nasty Instagram posts, whatever it might be.
And I would think that a place like Worcester and WPI should be able, like when we were first developing our 311 system, we did it with the help of WPI. I don't know if you were aware of this, but Fabio Carrera, who's faculty here,
Did not
helped,
know.
Yeah,
That's
helped
fantastic.
develop the original algorithm.
Very cool.
But it also has the added advantage. So I think that an interesting opportunity between the city and WPI would be to explore some novel features, and because like 311 systems are pretty vanilla at this point, and so I think there's some room for
customization, localization.
exactly
Yeah.
some trying out some newer and
Yeah.
riskier things, and
Love
I think that often sends a signal to the private sector to say that we're interested in trying new things.
Yeah.
And so that's often a good place to start.
Yeah, and I like this idea too of kind of signaling that hey, we're this is a place you can come try stuff.
And it also pulls in academics, right?
Yeah,
That's how I
yeah.
first met Dan, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about what you learned from the 311 project? I'm sort of fascinated by that too. And by the way, feel free to make other remarks too, but
Yeah.
it sounds like it was interesting.
Of course. No, I'll answer
Yeah.
that question. I'll tie it back
Yeah.
to where Nigel's going as well. So essentially, we went into this wondering, well, why do people use this system, right? Because as Nigel said, we conceptualized it early on as, right, this is a collaboration. It's a collaboration between government and the public, and the government's job is to fix the things that the public identifies as needing fixing. And we knew what the government was going to do. It was going to get triggered by a call and then go take action. We didn't really know what the public was going to do, right? When and why they would actually pick up a phone and make a call. And so we had a lot of spirited debates back in somewhere around 2011 about what this was. And I think a lot of the early proponents of 311 thought it was political participation, that it was another opportunity to vote with one's phone, right? To be engaged civically and politically in between elections, so to speak. And so I actually am a biologist by training. I've sort of meandered across the disciplines, and my argument was this looks like territoriality to me. Not in a bad way, but in this way of this is my space, I care about it, and that pothole is really annoying. And so I'm going to call this in. And so we did a number of different studies looking at where people called from, surveying people, and we found that 81% of people have never made a report more than 2 blocks away from their home. In fact, 80% of all reports come from that same radius. And so this starts to point to, right, this is a neighborhood phenomenon. This is a hyper-local thing. It's not really about civic engagement. And people actually, it turns out, having voted in the previous election, had no predictive power of whether you used 311 to call in an issue in the public space. Having volunteered, having donated to a charity, no predictive power. Saying that you cared about your neighborhood and wanted to enforce expectations for its maintenance, that's what predicted whether you used 311 or not for these purposes. And so from that story then, right, one of the beauties of BARI and having this sort of committed research policy collaboration is that we then did experiments, right? So Nigel and I and some of his colleagues, we cooked up this idea of, well, if you put out flyers that said clean up Boston and you put out other flyers that say clean up Dudley Square, clean up Eagle Hill, what happens? Turns out that a flyer about the neighborhood gets people to report more. Turns out that a flyer that says clean up Boston is as good as not distributing any flyers. And so, you know, we then did a number of other experiments kind of looking at, okay, how do we translate this information that, you know, as a nerdy academic, I get to kind of write about and think about in a sort of navel-gazing kind of way. But then how do we turn it into practice? How do we have the rubber hit the road? And I think that's really exciting. And I think to double back to where do you start, that first question, I think Nigel's exactly right. You find a gentle on-ramp, because a project like that was really low stakes. The data already existed, right? And it was definitely a priority of Nigel's office, but also the Menino administration at the time, to kind of be able to understand how this neighborhood engagement in the age of technology was going. And so then being able to provide kind of small wins, you know, little insights, dividends that we could pay back to the city in terms of, yeah, this is what we learned. This is what this type of thinking can produce. It starts to then kind of spread through other agencies, to even your more kind of you know, tasked departments, shall we say, things like public schools, which is historically takes a little more time to innovate, right, around these sorts of things, given the tasks that they have. And so then you start to see real culture change. And at the end of the day, what you need is culture change, because if you build, I'll go on a slight tangent here. I once saw a city show up at a conference, and this woman from the city, I won't name the city, stood up in front of the room and said, "We have a smart city now." Full stop.
Done.
Right?
Easy.
And then we want to know what you think we should do with it. And
That's funny.
And I just kind of sat there like, how much money did you spend?
Right,
You
now
don't
what?
know what to do with this thing? It was a little bit like buying, 20 years ago, buying your grandmother a computer and just putting it in the basement and hoping she'd figure out how to turn it on. So I think what you need is culture change to have everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people in City Hall and in the associated buildings knowing what to do, or at least having having goals for what to do with data and technology, so that when you make those big investments, when you want to start to pursue those larger forms of physical change, you have the human capital behind it to capitalize and to take serious action.
Yeah, it's interesting that to me the big insight here is it's not being a smart city or technology or data is not this thing that's apart from the core of what the city's trying to accomplish. It's got to be a part of it. It's got to be integrated from the beginning, or it won't succeed, because there need to be users of that data. There need to be people who benefit from the collection of that data. And again, the whole goal of our city is to make our communities, people in our communities' lives better. And so that's great. So my next question is about barriers that you've seen in other communities working towards smart use of data and technology to serve their citizens. Are there some big barriers that you've seen? Are there some big pitfalls that you've seen? You just gave a great story about we built a smart city and what the heck do we do with it? That's a good one, sort of not connecting the data to human need. But are there other pieces of advice about, don't fall into that pothole that you might give us? Anybody can jump on in.
There are tons of barriers,
Oh.
as you might get. There's nothing but barriers, frankly.
I was trying really hard not to be ironic.
Well, that's okay.
as
But
I
that's
asked the
okay.
question.
But that's okay. It doesn't
Is
mean that
change hard?
they're not insurmountable. Like culture change, I think, is really the name of the game in local government. And the challenge is there's no department of culture change,
Yeah.
generally speaking.
Yeah.
And local governments don't tend to think about that issue. They do tend to articulate, what's broken, what do we got to
Yeah.
fix it, and so on. So I think it does help to create some person or some people who are thinking in those terms, right? So you might want to create an office of neuromechanics. You can call it whatever you want. But over the last several years, big national foundations like the Bloomberg Philanthropies have been funding the creation of innovation teams in cities. And it was a little bit clunky in the beginning in terms of like what counts as innovation. And so for a while, one of the places where people get stuck, if you're going to go down that road, oftentimes the innovation teams get stuck on trying to define innovation, which is a zero-sum game for everybody. It's a complete waste of time, right? My counsel there is just start doing things, because you can't know what you're good at a priori before you've actually done anything. So do whatever comes your way and just be a little bit, give it a little bit of forethought. So that's a big one. Sort of the troubles associated with creating an innovation team. Oftentimes in parallel with the innovation team comes a data team. And I think there's also a bunch of pitfalls there. And I think one of them is to think that once you've created an open data portal, you're done. You're done with that challenge. And I've seen this done by lots of cities. They say, oh, we put our data online, we're done, we did it.
Yeah.
It was just like the smart cities thing. And what they find after about a year is nobody is using that data. And so more thought needs to go into it, right? So once just publishing the data is a good start, but you have to think about who is using the data, right? It's an obvious opportunity to reach out to your research community, and to local philanthropies and social ventures and so on. So it's a good place to start, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient. I think a lot of cities get stuck. I mean, I'll go on forever if you.
No,
right?
no, this is good
So
stuff,
another
right?
place where
This is-
cities often get stuck is hackathons. And so I love a good hackathon,
Sure.
right? But they are relatively easy to do, and then often people declare victory
Yeah.
after you fed people a bunch of
Pizza.
pizza and Coke.
did
Why is it
donuts.
always
We
pizza?
did
Why
donuts.
can't we have like falafel at
Some
at
sushi.
hackathons?
Come
I don't
on,
know.
help us out here.
But it is another moment because you feel good, right? It's a nice political moment
Yeah.
because the mayor might show up, and then he or she can look out at the sea of shining faces. Oftentimes, it's a very different group of people than who the mayor usually sees at community meetings, right? So it feels like victory. You see, middle class, upper middle class people of different backgrounds and so on, technology people, but in and of itself, it's another example, another way to send a signal
Yeah.
that we are open
Yeah.
to approach us. But I think that when it's approached as an end in and of itself, it often doesn't yield great results.
So there can be a lot of sort of one-off things that don't actually
Right.
result
It's
in
a nice
systemic change.
right. I think that you have to be thinking in terms. It's like a campaign,
Right.
A campaign consists of like a series of events over time, and so I think that way of thinking is more efficacious than just we'll do the thing, it'll be done. And then the last thing I think that a lot of cities, and which is very similar to the other points I've made, is the idea, kind of similar to what Dan was saying, that there's a couple ways to say this. I think the idea that procurement is broken and prevents innovation is a red herring,
Yeah.
right? So like we've done all of the work that we've done mostly inside procurements.
Processes.
I will say in the first couple of years of my doing this work, I had no idea. I came from the startup world. I didn't know what was good and what was bad. And subsequently, we got a lawyer, and the lawyer looked at all our old contracts and procurements, and he said, 100% of the work you've done to date is illegal. I was breaking procurement law.
So don't do
not
that.
grossly, a little bit. And so a little bit of
Slightly
knowledge can
illegal.
help. And so, but I think that the idea that it's procurement that prevents us from doing it is just not true.
Because you can work within
Because
the
you can
system
work with
as
it.
long
I
as
mean,
you understand
yeah,
the system.
I mean, procurement is really just a bunch of rules invented by humans,
Right.
not by machines.
Right.
And so you can go a long way into fixing procurement by just writing better documents.
Right.
We're writing them as though you knew that someone was going to read them, because they are, but we
Yeah.
often write them in bureaucraties
Yeah.
for ourselves. But if instead we focus on the prose of the documents and
Yeah.
just writing good documents, it goes a huge, like a lot of the most interesting startups that we've seen in the procurement space, that's all they do. Really, 90% of what they do is about helping cities write better documents.
Nice.
So there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah,
and
wow,
a lot
that's
of
actually
pitfalls
super
that can,
helpful answer. Thank you. Do either one of you want to add anything about barriers? I mean, in terms of getting new technology deployed
Yeah.
in cities, I mean, what's the...
I think it's twofold for us. It's definitely the technology side of things changes, right? I mean, even in the 2 years space that we've already seen acquisitions and companies drop out, new companies come in, and
The dynamism of the market in this
Yep.
stuff is...
Yep. So
it
one
can
company
be
you
a
think you're
challenge,
partnering
yeah.
with is already not a company
Yeah.
anymore. So,
Yeah.
and that and financial. So the more I talk to cities is where do they come up with the money, and where do they get it, and how do they make the best use case for it and show the value for it. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is remember that list of all those use cases I had, 13 or so. For each one of those, we're trying to do what we're in essence a benefit cost
ROI,
analysis of
yeah.
each one of these to say, all right, how much is it really? And some of that we're putting into some societal and economic or environmental benefits as well. It's not all about money, but the reality is we have to show some value for the dollar. And for each one of those use cases, we're going after some type of BCA. So once we figure it all out over the next year and a half or so, I'm happy to share those results with you guys and see what they can do for a city like Schenectady. But again, it's going to vary per city. So that's the challenge as well.
Yeah. But it's good to see it happening in a city of that scale, which
Yeah.
isn't that different from Worcester. So
I was gonna say,
that's
can I make
Yeah.
one other point?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think this is in particular for a city like Worcester that has a great startup scene. I would think that you should also look to the startup scene to engage them in the dynamic, because companies like National Grid are good anchor partners, but I would argue that a lot of these smaller companies that have sort of much more recent history are just able to be more
Yeah,
dynamic,
agile
right? Because they don't
yeah.
have a lot of
Yeah.
prior sunk costs and things, and so they can start more nimbly, and they can often be. I hope I'm not impugning you, but
No.
but they can often be more reactive
Yeah.
Yeah.
and be responsive in a way that these other larger companies can't. So
So I know.
And this is why they're partnering with them.
And
Right?
we're a small group called Innovation and Development
Yeah.
inside this giant,
Yeah.
Yep.
giant company. So
Yeah.
we're a very rogue group of people trying to make change, but it's not easy to do.
Cool.
Yeah.
So no, I definitely hear you there.
Mhm.
Dan, anything else to add?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I'll say anything too different, except it might sound a little different because my perspective from sort of collaborating outside of government, it gets back to this idea of culture change. And so, we did a study. We looked at, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Commonwealth Connect. This was an attempt to take what Boston had done with 3-in-1 and export it to other cities. And we actually interviewed 20 cities that had implemented it to find out when it worked, and why it didn't. And what we basically found was, if it works, everything fits together, right? The mayor or town manager is supportive, the public works department is supportive, the IT department is supportive, and everyone gets it. And basically, if any one of those pieces fell apart, it's like a circuit, right? So any piece of the circuit that goes off, the whole thing is off. It's like your 1980s Christmas lights. When one of those lights goes out, the whole thing is down. And so and I've seen that in practice where there's, I think Nigel was alluding to this. Government tends to be a risk-averse place, right? As one of my mentors told me when I first got into this job, right? You get elected at certain points, or you get appointed by someone who is elected, and as long as you keep the lights on and the streets safe, right, you're kind of okay. You're doing a pretty good job at your job. But innovating too much really opens you up to risk, right? It really opens you up to the possibility that, well, I screwed that up, right? And what happens next, right? And I mean, to Nigel's point, also lawyers, by definition, by their practice, and I don't mean this as I think it's part of the job, are relatively risk averse as well, right? Their tendency is to be able to say no, right, rather than to say yes, let's do it. And I think finding ways to create a culture of we want to try something new, and selling that to the people, so that jobs feel comfortable, right? That you're not kind of risking your job every time you show up to the office, which again, I think Nigel and people like him around the country who have done these sorts of jobs have found a way to pitch that publicly. But it is really about changing the approach of government to be able to constantly think about innovation, whereas that hasn't historically been the nature of the industry, so to speak.
Yeah, fascinating. So let's see, I'll maybe ask one more question, and then we'll coming out to all of you. Think about those questions. So can a city be too smart? I'm working on my accent. I'm from Arizona, guys. So yeah, too wicked smart. What are the unintended consequences or the risks around all these data? I think each of you actually have touched on it a little bit about, it's possible to imagine moving in this direction and leveraging data and other technology for social justice reasons, for good. But it's, there's a lot of talk right now about, AI is only smart because it learns from the past, which is a heck of a prejudicial past, right? And so how do we think about social justice in the context of smart cities? How do we think about building trust and dealing with the fears that people have about optical sensors, and which I love that euphemism.
It's a good euphemism, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. Yeah, it's a bunch of cameras everywhere. How do we start to unpack some of those risks? Because I do think you're right that cities are risk averse, and if citizens get nervous, then that's a real concern, and a fair enough one.
I mean, I think it's funny. I'd almost kind of flip the question. I think if you start to get yourself in those situations, you weren't really smart enough. Yeah. Right. You sort of you
didn't do
drank,
it right.
Yeah, you drank the Kool-Aid and you ran after
Yeah.
the opportunity here, but you missed the fact that, and whatever it might be, right? That I think we're learning a lot about predictive policing algorithms right now. I mean, I'm partially a criminologist, and so I've been thinking about this a lot with some colleagues. Like, can we even build a just predictive policing algorithm? Can we factor out the historical racial bias from this? That's actually an open question. We really want to. I really want to find out if it's even possible personally, rather than say we all should be adopting predictive policing. I think with a lot of these things, we need to really sit back and be critical, right? And I think we're getting to a good point where, as of 5 years ago, I think the only people working on this were the computational scientists and the engineers, right? And we're getting to the point where more and more social scientists can come in and help kind of pose challenging questions, right? What would the consequences of this be for, right? And then name 5 things, 10 things that we really should be probing and taking a look at. And so I think that developing a culture of innovation that questions whether the innovation is accomplishing what it hopes to, or whether, as it's doing so, is it impacting something else to the side, is becoming more and more a critical part of this process to being truly smart.
I really think like smart as an adjective can only be applied to people. maybe to AI, but mostly to people. And so I don't know that cities can be smart. I think that they can be well designed, they can be equitably designed, all these different characteristics. But I think, like just linguistically, you got to be human to be smart. You got to have a brain to be smart. I think it is in that context, it depends how we're defining smart. If we're defining smart, like as automation for its own sake, I mean, technology can easily run amok, right? When it's not thoughtfully done, and when people aren't considering issues of the ethics of how we're designing these things and who are they designed for. If all these new autonomous vehicle startups, if all they do is provide more services to the top 2% of income owners in cities, that's no good. That's useless to us. And so I think in some ways, as much as we are interested in technology and data and so on, we also have to be very considerate about the business models that are being developed. And so, was Uber a good thing or a bad thing for cities, right? People talk about this from both perspectives. On the one hand, they shook up an old sort of bureaucratic way of doing things, but they also put a lot of people out of jobs, and they destabilized some cities that rely on those jobs. And so, I think as long as we are putting to office elected officials that are honestly trying to focus on the needs of our residents, and I think that's an aspiration, because I don't think that always happens. I think oftentimes people get elected because they love politics and they want to do politics, and they just, they're actually developing the solutions for political reasons to get to higher office, and sometimes. And that's not wholly bad, but it also means that they're not all that coupled to the needs of their residents. And so I think these things can easily run amok.
Not to say that we shouldn't pursue the opportunities, though, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So
I think
that's where I want to come to before.
Yeah, I'm a
open it
computer
up.
scientist, right? So I'm a big believer
too.
that technology can make the world better. But I have learned sort of the hard lesson over the last 10 years about how we have to also, I was reminded about this the other day, in Canada, I'm Canadian, for every civil engineer that graduates, they get a steel ring. And the steel ring was from a major bridge that collapsed years ago. And the idea is that this is supposed to remind us as engineers that we have a social responsibility, that ethics is not the class that you cut out on when you're going through your 4-year degree, but it's actually it's really how you interact with the world at large. And so the ethics of technology are key.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is and when things are moving so quickly, that's when it can become it's extra important that you just take that time to figure out how to do this well.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the things I'm really proud about WPI Education, where we offer our students these opportunities all the time, working in 50 communities all over the world, where we bring together social science and technology to support people. And so we try and instill those ways of thinking and working by actually throwing the students across the globe into these communities to try and work directly with community organizations and the people that they're trying to help to get that lesson straight away. I would love to talk a little bit more about universities and how they can play a role here, but I want to we can come back to that. I want to open up the floor to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Yes, stand up and tell us who you are. And
Thank you. My name is Matt Wally. I'm a city councilor in Worcester. Thank you very much. And my question's to Nigel. How is your office in Boston developing and using data and technology to develop and benchmark goals and objectives? And then secondly, if you were to give advice for any city to develop an office similar to what you're doing, what would that advice be?
So we take our lead. So Boston for the last couple of years has been undergoing a strategic planning exercise called Imagine Boston. And so we never had such a thing before, right? Under Mayor Menino, he just didn't believe in them. And so we were kind of, I don't want to say flying blind, but we didn't really have a well-articulated set of principles for the future, for goals for the future. We have that now. And so now it gives us the language, the concepts, and the structures to think about where we want to go. And we will take a broad view in terms of thinking about the data that allows us to get there. I would argue, because I am very bullish about the role of social science in smart cities, so I would say that qualitative data is just as important as quantitative data. Understanding, do people like the service? Does it make them feel good? Do they feel respected? And using it is just as important as counting the number of people that actually showed up. So we think a lot about sort of the social dynamics of these services. For a city that was trying to create, that was the second part, right? The second, there's a lot of ways into this, right? And I think, I don't know if it's true, but I think it's true where it makes sense. I would start with from the perspective of trying to understand, as Dan was saying, what is the nature of the fear of failure in your city? Because every city's culture is a little bit different, right? In our city, when we did some study on this, when we were starting New Urban Mechanics, and we heard loud and clear that people believed that middle management was the place that good ideas, or ideas in general, go to die. And when we spoke to those people, what we heard was, on the one hand, they get a lot of pressure to be fiscally responsible, to be good stewards of the public dollar. And now we're asking them to be innovative and take risks. Those things are on different planets, right? They're completely orthogonal to each other. And so we realized that there was a need for us to develop a mechanism to de-risk some of these things, because that's what they were really worried about. So our approach in New Urban Mechanics is essentially to create a team. This is my team, the New Urban Mechanics team. That if Dan is a head of a department and he wants to explore some crazy new idea, or not even, or just a new idea, it doesn't have to be crazy, but he's worried about if it fails, how it will look to the public and to the mayor and to the press and so on. The idea is he can negotiate with us and basically ask us to help him develop an experiment to explore that idea, right? And so if it fails, we catch the hell, right? So we absorb the negative outcome of the experiment, and that works for us because that's our job, right? We are the experimentation team that have been given the permission to fail, not always, but sometimes. And so risk is, so this in a lot of ways, New Urban Mechanics was designed to be a risk aggregator, and that worked really well for the culture in Boston City Hall. That's in some ways what was needed. It was a way to kind of push risk off of your plate and to kind of free you up. To do these things in a way that wouldn't expose you to sort of, trolls and so on. That's where I would start.
Very good. Down front, and then Sue. Yes. Hi.
Hi, my name's Rachel Cohn. I work at a software company called Open Data Soft, and for the last 8 years, we've been working with all three sectors, whether it's nonprofits like universities and think tanks, or private companies in the infrastructure space, utilities, transportation operators, and of course state and local governments on exactly this topic on data sharing. And a challenge, I'll say two challenges that we've seen a lot of clients go through, hopefully you can touch on today, are as follows. The first one is the challenge of sharing data internally within different departments and teams. So I'll take an example of a state government we work with in southeastern part of the U.S. Various state agencies as well as city departments have difficulty sharing information with each other. Yeah. Universities, particularly scientists, sometimes do not often share information with each other. And of course, utilities. You don't want to share data because you don't want your competitors maybe to get them.
Right.
So I'm curious as how you've seen this cultural change and industry change happen with data sharing internal to your organization. And then the second portion of question I have is really about data sharing in terms of from a legal and liability perspective. There's data ownership, there's data access, and then there's data use and reuse. Mm-hmm. You talked about using data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but you also have to set up the framework of access and ownership and so forth to ensure there's both ownership and risk-taking and liability. So that's my second question about kind of how do you see in this technology and infrastructure space about the ownership, access, and use of data?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I mean, I think that's part of building the foundation for success here is how do you kind of set up your data infrastructure, how open is everything, and then how do you think about the use of the different data? Who wants to jump in there?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Unless John.
No, I mean, just real quick, if you don't mind. I think the way we're looking at it is, from a utility perspective, is to become more of like a platform provider, really. If you think about traditional utility model, right? We own the wires and the pipes. the gas and the electricity that flows through is yours. And I think we're looking at it the same way when it comes to our next evolution, when it comes to smart grid technology, that the data that flows through this system, this network, will be yours, if you will, or the end users, to do with it what they will. However, we still have to be good stewards of said data, right? We have to protect it. We got to make sure it's encrypted. We got to make sure it's safe. And that's going to be the challenge, is how do we create a safe network that we can transmit and share data. And I think that's our challenge as a utility over the next few years as we look to evolve and become smarter. So I don't have an answer for you, but I know we're thinking about it a lot. We have a SWAT team of data analysts and scientists now that we didn't have even 5-6 years ago in our company. Now you're just seeing the company change, and the whole industry, frankly, starting to change. So it's exciting times. I don't know if I have a good answer for you, though.
So I guess I can speak to two shifts, and neither one of them is seismic so far. But so I have a colleague in Pittsburgh. She runs an integrated data system for Allegheny County, which basically they take all of the data from all of the different human and health service departments, plus education, plus crime, so on and so forth, and they merge them at the social security number level. It's a massive undertaking, and it creates amazing applications, right? So they have some great systems for predicting the potential for child abuse, given a call to the center, right? Because they have to triage half those cases. And so then they have to say, okay, so which ones do we actually go after? So they have plenty of great applications, but she has a great line. She says, if the mayor has to sign both sides of the MOU, you don't need an MOU. And so essentially, and then it comes down to culture change, right? Then it comes down to basically having enough leadership, but also enough backstopping of that leadership and the middle management to come to agreement that essentially, and that's back to the lawyers, to sit down with the lawyers and say, we want to get this to happen. How do we use current regulations or revised regulations to be able to empower this sort of work? And so I think that's where it is in the public sector. In the academic sector, it's different, because academic sector, we're kind of all free radicals, right? We're all free agents. We collect data, and we do what we're going to do. And then, there's, the classic stories about someone who's been running great data work. There's some stories about someone at Northeastern a few years ago who retired, and basically they just found boxes upon boxes of data in an office, right, that no one had ever seen before. And there are various reasons for that. Most of it just has to do with competition and not wanting to be scooped, so to speak. But there is a bit of a move afoot. And so another colleague, Gary King, who is a professor at Harvard University, he directs a center called the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. He's built a platform called the Dataverse, which is a place where you can publish your data. And he's done this because he very much believes that we should all be sharing our data, now given rules about sensitivity and stuff like that, obviously taken into account, but that we should be doing that to be able to reproduce good science, to be able to enable others to build off of our science. But what's really witty about the whole, and clever about the whole system, is that it has citable DOIs, which is equivalent to a publication. So then, you can get a faculty member to publish their data that way, because then they get credit for it. If someone comes along and uses it, they can be cited. They can be referenced, and that's kind of the coin of our realm, and I feel like it's been successful. We've used it for our own Boston data portal, so we publish lots of data sets. A lot of stuff we actually take from the open data portal and we refurbish and we document in kind of research rigorous ways. Sorry, Nigel. And other things that we generate, and we put it out there in the public sphere, and we at least know that it will be cited, right? And that will have impact, and we'll get at least a little bit of credit for that impact. And I think that that's something that's happening slowly, and it starts with graduate students, right? You train graduate students to do that. You teach them that this is an important way to mark your work and to have continued impact, and then they do it through their career. You don't start by calling the 55, 60-year-old professor who has never done this before. You kind of need to build from the ground up.
And then we'll go to
So thinking, in terms of trying to get such a culture going, I think it helps a lot to think about the value proposition of shared data. In the early days, I think the story of 311 is very dense and is often really unexplored. There's a lot there, not only in our city, but in a lot of other cities as well. One of the big benefits to 311 data is that it allows you to manage back-end processes more effectively, right? And so nothing else works if you can't manage the process, right? And so that's really what enabled for us 311 to work well, is that we were able to manage it at a different level of fidelity. And so that was a direct outcome of having this data that everyone could see, and so it meant that like everyone knew that the different heads of the departments knew that everyone else could see that, and so that they were already on the hook, as it were, right? So that it meant that if you were fudging something, you couldn't do that anymore because everyone can see the data because it's on the open data portal, right? And so, we were fortunate to have a mayor then and now that was very clear about the need to constantly be getting better. And so my sense is, the sharing of data was definitely like a threatening. There's no doubt that a lot of these departments found it to be a threat. But I think there was a higher level goal, which was about improvement of the service, and that as long as they could sort of connect to that, so that in the end, although in the near term it was a little bit scary, in the long term it allowed them to be doing cool things and developing new services, and the mayor would be happy, and he would be talking about how he's proud of the innovation in the parks department or whatever. And so like that, thinking critically about and in detail about like the value proposition is a big enabler. And I mean the downstream, one of the, again, like we've sort of hinted about this, but having the data and being able to share it with these academics who did all kinds of fascinating work, that was also I don't know if it was a primary benefit, right? That no one would have said that was the reason why we did this, but I think it was a really nice to have, and it made us and our departments and our collaborators look that much more forward thinking. The fact that we were collaborating with, because then people could say, so now people will say, Dan's been at this for a while, but they'll actually say that as part of their innovation agenda, as it were, it's collaborations with universities, and that's basically Bari and Dan, and so there's that benefit as well.
Can I take Sue and then we'll do one more? Yeah.
I know you're up against it, I'll be
No, it's
quick.
all
I
right.
hope Nigel and John will both stick with your stodgy institutions, because we need these innovative departments in a big way, and you guys are gonna play an important role. John, how would you grade Schenectady in terms of community collaboration as they get off the ground?
So far it's been a really it's been a focus of the city to have better engagement. So for everything we've done, including the actual color temperature of the streetlights, we've engaged the community as to, do you like these ones better than these ones? Do you understand what this is for? Because the mayor, he knows. He doesn't want to roll out technology and then everyone finds out that the streetlights are listening to them, and no one knew that, and that would make him look good. He may not get reelected. Obviously, he's very concerned and very thoughtful mayor, and I think if there's any advice, it would be to try to follow those type of footsteps, where for every technology that you deploy, that you have some level of community engagement, so people understand what you're trying to do in the city, and then also shamelessly self-promote that in the newspaper, right, and show how wonderful you're doing. I think that's been it's been a good start, but I think we need to do more. Yeah.
And then this question.
Hi everybody, my name's Jim Idelson. I'm CEO of a company that does analytics, big data applied to optimizing the use of information technology in enterprise. My question is about skills and experience and what you need on your team to be successful in this new marketplace. Basically, we all know that you have core competencies based on your traditional businesses. What kind of people and job descriptions do you need to add to your teams? Your team as a provider, and Nigel, your team as a designer and consumer of these kinds of solutions.
Great.
I mean, I'll start things off if you want.
Go
I mean,
for it.
we're
No,
a
go
utility.
for it.
We
Yeah.
predominantly employ engineers. I mean, it's the most, and I've been in the new energy solution space for a while, and I can't even show my face on the third floor in engineering because I was the guy that said, well, let's put a battery down here instead of a diesel generator, and that didn't go over well, right? So when you're trying to create change, I think what we're trying to see now is it's kind of threefold. It's folks who understand kind of the startup world. We're starting to hire people from that, and they don't really think utilities are particularly attractive, but we're getting some people in because it's starting to happen, starting to change. So we're starting to see a lot more folks from the startup world, and I think we're looking for more so, and I mentioned it briefly, data analytics. We have a data analytics team, advanced data analytics, and we're looking more so how to build a smarter and stronger grid as well, and how do we then incorporate new technologies into it at the same time, and at the same time, how do we then change? So there's a lot of talk on data analytics, and I think folks who have the ability to take risks and look for new business models.
Are you hiring people into positions to answer some of those harder questions, the non-technical questions, the questions about the use of data, why, the whys, the business planning, the business model?
Yeah,
things
that's
like
in
that?
essence my role. There's folks like us who came from business backgrounds and are coming in trying to develop new business models, and it's not always easy. But we get shot down a lot internally, and then we get to go externally and try to make it happen if it gets approved. So yeah, we're a lot of folks from a business perspective, business acumen, is what we're looking for as we're starting to change.
Other quick comments as we
People in my world, people that have a background in social ventures and social entrepreneurs often do really well. I wouldn't say startups, but in a lot of startups, having come from a startup world, we have basically like one metric, right? Dollars, right? Or market share or whatever euphemism. And in the work that we do, we don't have that luxury, right? Because every single thing that we do is so multi-dimensional, right? There's both the thing in and of itself, so you're rolling out a new solution. Does it solve the problem? Do people like it? What about the historical context? All those things are always there, whether or not, and what's the political impact also. I mean, all those things are part of our calculus when we're thinking about what we're doing. And so a lot of times, folks from who have a social innovation background oftentimes are able to thread that needle, that are able to understand the multidimensionality of the problem. So we end up hiring, so the kinds of people that we need, frankly, I don't know that they map cleanly to other industries. So I need a smart person. I need a person that has a high EQ, right? Because I need someone that can read the room. When the mayor's yelling at you, is he really yelling at you? Or is he really trying to get you to move? I need people that can operate in a big bureaucracy. Not everyone can, and people that are able to do that and bring the creativity with them, right? And so that's a lot of skills, from people. And so when we find those people, we just hire them if we can. And oftentimes these people bring really interesting side skills, and so as a result, we have video game designers and filmmakers and professional fencers on our team. Yeah.
Wow, fencers, that might come in handy.
You never know.
Maybe. Hasn't yet, but it may yet.
Dan, just real quick as we close out.
Yeah, so I'll answer the question tangentially, but also getting to the question Lori never got to ask,
Yeah, thank you.
which is the role of universities, right? So I've sort of danced around the one side, which is we're researchers, we ask questions, we can help you answer questions, yada, yada, yada. But the other side is, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are the vehicle for technology transfer, right? We train the next generation of professionals, right? That is literally our job. That is what a master's program is. And so, as John and Nigel describe combinations of skills that may sound a little daunting right now, we probably have to think back, right, 30, 40 years ago, the third industrial revolution, there was a different set of skills together that no one had seen before, and we figured out how to develop the educational programs for that. And so Northeastern, we've been working very hard. I'm in a school of public policy, right, and I run a master's in urban informatics, but I also work with the master's in public administration, the master's in public policy, so on and so forth, to figure out how to intermingle our curricula so that someone could go into Nigel's office and be able to think about transportation, but also know how to analyze an 1 million record data set in R, and to be able to combine those skills. And I'm sure WPI is thinking about similar programs, but basically universities have to innovate right now to be able to provide that sort of Renaissance person that we need for today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's no one major. The really fascinating thing to me about this moment is, I think we might look back on it and say, wow, it's the moment when we really had to get serious about more integrative learning across the beyond the traditional disciplines and even far beyond just the technical discipline, but really being serious about bringing together the human and social sciences, humanities and social sciences with technology in order to get the people who both have those timely skills, those skills you need today to be able to contribute in the world of big data, but also the timeless skills, those skills that are going to serve them in terms of interacting with people in real communities and solving real problems. And that's really what we're focused on here, and through programs like data science, where we've had for many years now a master's and Ph.D. and are about to start an undergraduate program, and but integrating these other skills as well. It's a really exciting moment to be thinking about breaking down the traditional barriers in academia to the collaboration across the silos. So with that, I've gone long, I'm sorry, but this was such a fascinating conversation. I absolutely want to thank John, Nigel, and Dan once again for being with us, and looking forward to future conversations continuing with thinking about how we can best serve our citizens in this era of new data and technology. So thanks for being with us.